The vegetation in Pennsylvania changed immensely over the last several hundred years. There's been an entire conversion. In some places of Pennsylvania, the forest was predominantly a coniferous forest. White pine, hemlock, even some spruce in some places. And a lot of those areas, when they were logged over 150 years ago, when they grew back, they converted to a temperate deciduous biome. So as that temperate deciduous forest grew in, certain species that preferred the pine and hemlock forest started to decline. Species that preferred the deciduous trees, the oaks, the chestnuts, started to thrive. Now that's given that you didn't also have hunting pressure and other things affecting those wildlife numbers. But let's discuss some of the species that aren't here anymore. Quite possibly the most significant was the American chestnut. The American chestnut tree grew to amazing heights. Most valuable, though, were the seeds that came from the American chestnut. Virtually everything ate it. The seeds from the American chestnut provided not only valuable food to Native Americans and early European settlers, but also to wildlife. And in 1904, a disease came into North America called the chestnut blight. And as that blight spread, it has virtually wiped out large, mature American chestnut trees from the mountains and valleys of Pennsylvania. Now, lucky for us, we have other species like the oak, like the hickory, the walnut, that still produce seeds. I'm standing next to a shagbark hickory. Hickories, oak trees, and several other species of nut trees and seed trees still produce a very valuable supply of protein foods to grazing wildlife. Now, the American chestnut was quite possibly the most significant food supplying tree to wildlife historically. Problem is, in 1904, a blight came over from Europe, and that chestnut blight has spread throughout Pennsylvania, and it's not considered extinct yet, but it is virtually gone from the overstory the way it used to be. It used to be in certain counties, Pennsylvania, 1 out of every 5 trees was a chestnut tree. And they grew up to enormous heights. They produced an unbelievable amount of seed. Now, that tree disappeared for the most part from our forest. Thank goodness we still have trees like hickory, like oak, that are going to still be able to feed wildlife. Now, what would happen if we ever lost all of our oak trees, if we ever lost all of our hickory trees? It would be a pretty significant problem to our wildlife species that rely on some type of nut or seed every fall to be able to stock up for the winter months on some protein.
Oh, the shagbark hickory is a mighty hard tree, and it grows in the lowlands by the rivers and streams. When the snow is falling and the wind blows cold, then the shagbark hickory holds its own.
There's a term in Pennsylvania forestry called the green lie. And the green lie is this. A lot of folks, as they drive around Pennsylvania, they see nice, lush, green forests. And so they think to themselves, well, I don't know what all the concern is about preserving Pennsylvania forest land. I see plenty of green space around. But in many cases, that green space that you see is filled with species that are not from Pennsylvania. In fact, in many cases, not even from North America. So although it might look green, upon closer inspection, you'll find it's trees from Asia, it's plants from Europe, from Africa, from all over the world. And Pennsylvania wildlife species, in many cases, do not even recognize it as a source of food or as habitat. So therefore it is left to just grow on its own with no predation, and therefore it continues to grow. It's hard not to find a place in Pennsylvania that isn't covered with species that aren't native to Pennsylvania. One of the most common is called Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed obviously comes from Asia, and it was for a long time actually used by mining companies to reclaim a strip mine. So after they were done strip mining and the state required them to reclaim the land and replant vegetation, a lot of times they used to plant non-native species. Now, it's not all mining companies' fault. Many of these species came in from landscaping and plant dealers as well. And although they might be beautiful in a home garden and they might look pretty in a well-manicured area, once they get into the natural area, they often take over. And it is not uncommon, especially along the Susquehanna River banks, to find acres and acres of nothing but Japanese knotweed. A good way to identify it, it's hollow inside, almost like bamboo, gets very big broad leaves, and virtually nothing eats it, because the species here in Pennsylvania, the white-tailed deer and so forth, they don't recognize it as a food source because it is from Asia. It is not from North America. So as everything else continues to be eaten by wildlife, species like this are virtually left to just grow and grow and grow and multiply. Unfortunately, there's really no long-term solution to this except spraying with chemicals, which isn't necessarily the safest option, or manually cutting it down, which again is extremely labor-intensive. Another example of a tree that is kind of left unchecked by predation is the striped maple. Now the striped maple is a little unique in that it's not necessarily from another continent. Unfortunately, it's from right here in Pennsylvania. What has foresters a little bit puzzled is that it was never necessarily as prevalent as it is today. If you look behind me, all of the green understory, and I mean all of the green understory behind me, is 100% striped maple. And it never really grows big enough to be of much of a tree of value. In other words, so it's not really a lumber valuable tree. It gets to be a few inches in diameter and will eventually die and be replaced by smaller shrubby striped maple. White-tailed deer, for the most part, don't eat it. Insects, for the most part, don't eat it. So what's puzzling foresters is why all of a sudden the explosion of striped maple throughout Pennsylvania. And the concern is, as you can see, it clogs the bottom of the forest. The understory and all of the sunlight, for the most part, is being consumed by the striped maple. Therefore, new oak trees and new pine trees can't grow up and regenerate. Some people say it's the acid rain that is causing this explosion of striped maple, that it prefers the acidic water and the acidic soils. Some people say it's the oppression of forest fires, that we don't have forest fires like we used to, and therefore the striped maple is able to come back. The striped maple has another nickname, moosewood. And as you go into New England, places like Maine, striped maple is eaten by the moose. Now, I think it'd be a stretch to suggest that the reason we have too much striped maple is that the moose has been extirpated from Pennsylvania. I won't suggest that, but I do find that interesting, that there's a connection between one of our extirpated species being gone now, the moose being gone, and now we have one of its food sources exploding. Again, I think it would be too much of a stretch to suggest that the moose would have kept these numbers in check. I think there's more things at play. Now, possibly the absence of the moose plays a role in it, but I think a good possibility is that acid rain and the oppression of forest fire are a much better explanation for why we have such a huge problem with the striped maple. Now, in addition, there's also been some changes in vegetation simply from pollution. Acid rain, which is caused by the burning of high sulfur bituminous coal in the Ohio River Valley especially, as that acidic precipitation falls in Pennsylvania, we have increased the acidity of the soil. Some species like acidic soil, however, many species are being found to be declining in numbers. Now, we looked a little bit at the striped maple, and we looked a bit at some of the other invasive species. They could very well be attached to an increase of acidity in the soil. Perhaps that's why their numbers are increasing. But certain species are known to decline in acidic soils. So the current debate is whether or not many of our temperate deciduous trees like the oaks, like the hickories, are they not regenerating in the expected numbers because of acid rain, or are they not regenerating because of increased deer population, or perhaps both? But one thing is for sure, the acid rain impact on Pennsylvania is still quite significant. So in our video today, we've explored a very valuable heritage that we have here in Pennsylvania. The forests and the valleys and the rivers of Pennsylvania have changed quite a bit over the last several hundred years. However, there's still a thriving natural ecosystem around us. And if nothing else, we need to take away from our history a very valuable lesson. We cannot treat the land as something that can be abused and harvested and never expect consequences. We must remember that we are residents, part of the land, and we must continue to properly manage our wildlife and our forest here in Pennsylvania. Otherwise, 500 years from now, someone might be making a video about the trees that no longer occur in Pennsylvania. Perhaps they'll lament the loss of the oak, the maple. Perhaps they'll talk about the white-tailed deer that used to be here. It might sound preposterous. However, 500 years ago, I suggest if you would have asked a Native American if they ever thought the elk or the mountain lion or the moose could ever physically be removed from Pennsylvania, they would have laughed at the idea. And yet here we are today, 500 years later, and we certainly have inherited a different ecosystem. My name is Wagner. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video and cherishing what once was here in Pennsylvania.